Great. Well, happy Saint Jean Baptiste Day, everyone. This is the Remote Sensing Certification and Training Panel discussion. The Canadian remote sensing community has over a 50-year history of nationally coordinating remote sensing activities and programs. Remote sensing technology, data, and applications were once the domain of a small number of experts. But now, with open data, consumer drones, and web tools like Google Earth, it has become a more mainstream and accessible discipline in many ways. We have a rich history of remote sensing education in Canada, but little in the way of guidelines or standardization of training that addresses either national or corporate interests or the preparation of practitioners. So in this panel, we will explore training gaps and whether there is value or a desire in creating a society-led certification program. This discussion draws from and builds upon the education session that was led by Bob Ryerson today, where Ellsworth, who's on our panel today, presented a history of remote sensing education in Canada, and also the student and young professional mentorship panels that were led by Laura Chasma last year and Hamdi and Celeste this year. Unfortunately, due to the tight schedule this afternoon, we have less time for this panel than the others that we've hosted thus far in the symposium, and we also have more panelists. So I'm afraid to say we must be disciplined with time. There's a short break at the end of this session, but then we're rapidly into two more sessions. So let's try to be disciplined. I will start by introducing our panelists, then asking each of them to provide their thoughts on two questions. They will each have up to 4 minutes to summarize their thoughts. Meanwhile, Celeste and I will open an audience poll to gain some high-level perspectives on the need for certification. And during the panel presentations and the poll collection, please feel free to add any of your comments or questions into the Q&A for further panel discussion. And I think you're all familiar with that process by now. Then 5 minutes before the end of the session, we will end the question period. Again, we're going to be disciplined on time, and we'll share the poll results and as well as some of the feedback from the questionnaire that was circulated to many of you a few weeks ago. And thank you, of course, to those of you that did respond. We had 92 responses. And so I think that represents fairly healthy cross-section of our community. Okay, so logistics. Let me share my screen so that I may introduce the panelists and the questions. So just bear with me for 1 second while we do this. Oh. Sorry, wrong button. I should know this off by heart by now. Okay, can someone confirm for me you can see my PowerPoint?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So here we go, our panelists. I would like to welcome and thank very much the 7 panelists that are joining me today. So just by way of an introduction, I'll do everybody in one go because that'll help us get through things more quickly. So Ellsworth LeDrew, a past president of our society from 1999 to 2001, professor emeritus from the University of Waterloo, and also for his illustrious remote sensing career in teaching and research, he was awarded the Larry Morley Gold Medal in 2005. Laura Chasma, Associate Professor at the University of Lethbridge in the Department of Geography and Environment. Laura chaired the SYP session last year, and as a follow-up to that, authored an article on remote sensing education with Bob Ryerson and Craig Coburn. Gordon Staples also serves on our society executive and has done for many years, is a senior scientist with MDA Corporation, active in remote sensing project management and radar training. Joanne White, a government research scientist with the Canadian Forest Service. Her research focuses on LiDAR and optical time series analysis for forest monitoring and inventory. And Joanne is also a prodigious author on this topic. Hamdi is a PhD student with Ryerson University. His research focuses on LiDAR and camera integration. He's also on the CSRS SCT executive and also employed by Teledyne Optech. So Hamdi brings both a student and an industry perspective to this panel. Liz brings an international perspective to our panel as a senior support scientist with the NASA Above program. As well as collaborating on many research projects, Liz also coordinates Above outreach and training activities. And last but of course not least, Craig Coburn is professor and department chair in geography and environment at the University of Lethbridge. He has many years of frontlines remote sensing education experience. And Craig also led the initiative to develop what we believe was the first MSc in remote sensing in Canada, and is now pioneering the development of micro-credential courses at our university. So we have a rich and varied range of experience there in remote sensing and in training. And so we're basically going to pick the brains of our panelists on whether or not it's a good idea to move forward with a certification program. So in order to get the discussion going on this, we have 2 questions for each panelist, and we'll go through each panelist in turn, and they'll provide their perspectives on these 2 questions within 4 minutes. If we go over 4 minutes, I will remind each speaker that we need to move on. So the first question: are the remote sensing training offerings in Canada meeting the needs of the remote sensing community? Very broad question, many different perspectives on that, I'm sure. So we could, for example, consider the service and product delivery sector, students and trainees, and if there are gaps, what are they? And then the second question: do we need a certification program to address these gaps, if there are any, and or promote some level of national standardization? Now, at this point, I'm just going to very, very briefly stop sharing. Now, Celeste, could you also put a poll up so that our audience can now participate? Okay, thank you, Celeste. So everyone now should be able to see on the right-hand side of their screen. And if it isn't, just go onto the bottom and click on poll, so you can open up the poll on the right-hand side. And you should see a number of questions. The first one: should the CSRS SCT develop a certification program? So we'd just like your opinion on that. Second one: would you seek certification if we did create a program? And then just some demographic information. So we're not looking for email addresses or anything like that, just whether or not you're a student, trainee, whether you supervise individuals and with remote sensing credentials, and or whether you're an educator in the field. So if you could just answer yes or no to those, that will allow us to stratify the results. 5 minutes before the end of the Q&A period, I will cut it off. I will present to you the real-time poll results, and immediately thereafter, we will also present some of the results from the questionnaire that went out a few weeks ago. And it'll be really interesting to see whether we get the same kind of split in response. Okay, so without further ado, I would like to go to the panelists. Let me just share my screen again. And we'll start with Ellsworth. Just one note, the first few panelists will speak to some slides, and then the last few panelists, it'll be talking heads. And then when we've done this process, it'll all be happy, smiley faces and talking heads. And so it's not all going to be death by PowerPoint, so don't worry about this. Okay, so I'd like to pass that question over to you, Ellsworth. 4 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. I guess I was asked to look at this because Bob Ryerson and I had just done a study on the remote sensing university landscape, both at universities and colleges throughout Canada. And on the top left, I present some of the main results from a paper that we gave earlier this afternoon. Basically, we sent out questionnaires to as many people throughout Canada that we could identify. And for those that we didn't get a response from, we looked at every website throughout the universities and colleges of Canada. And this gives a sense of where we're at right now. Out of 127 institutions that we sent out questionnaires to, we can identify 65 that have got remote sensing programs. There are over 127 faculty, and there are 128 undergrad courses, et cetera. So that gives a sense of what we're offering in a formalized environment. At the top right, I did a little bit more research as to what's being offered in terms of specialist programs. And surprisingly, the Canadian Institute of Geomatics has got a certified geomatics specialist, remote sensing. However, there are only 2 members in there. One is from Canada, another one is from Aberdeen. So that's sort of not moving very fast. I also did a review of how many certificate programs there are in GIS. Regrettably, this survey excluded Quebec for some reason. But without that, there are 20 GIS certificate programs being offered by universities and various colleges and technical institutions. But there's only one that includes remote sensing, and that's York University Certificate in Geographic Information Systems and Remote Sensing. So to go to the second question, my perspective, coming from a university, I've just taught about 2 years of online courses, which were not designed to be for the COVID environment. It was done before that, but certainly it is being modulated by the COVID environment. And it seems to me that a lot of universities have had to realign their educational mandate to respond to that. And this might give us some lessons in terms of how we might be able to offer a certificate program in the future. what this can also offer is an opportunity for a nationwide and consistent syllabus. Whereas right now, all these certificates are done ad hoc by different groups, and it might be useful to look at that. There is a history in terms of remote sensing in that very early on in the 1970s and 80s, the CSRS was trying to get a nationwide educational program off the ground, but it was hindered by the fact that education is a provincial mandate. And that might be something we would have to contend with as well if we get into validation, for example. So that's the third point. And then we have to look at teaching remote sensing. And this goes back to the online experience. There are a lot of challenges here in terms of students working with large masses of data. If we look at the data cubes right now coming from the States and from ESA, we can get a sense of the magnitude of the processing involved and some very advanced algorithm development. On the other hand, we're making a lot of developments in network computing resources, particularly in things like Python-based open source opportunities. So the two may be balanced off. So from an educational point of view, if I could summarize, there are a lot of opportunities here, a chance to do things differently, and a chance to take advantage of the current technology that we've got at hand. So at that, I'll move on to the next person.
Thank you very much, Elspeth. That was almost exactly 4 minutes. Brilliant. Okay, thank you. Laura, your turn.
Thanks very much, Chris. Yes, I'm going to present a little bit on the remote sensing training gaps and needs with regards to professionals versus trainees from a survey that we did last year at the CSRS in the Students and Young Professionals program. And this survey went on for about 6 months, where we gathered, I think it was well over 100 respondents in both the trainee and professional camp. And so I'm going to basically outline kind of what the perspectives were from both trainees and professionals. And basically what we found is that there are really two groups of people who are interested in remote sensing training. And I think that, you know, this comes to this idea of a modular certification program. The first is that there are a lot of people who have no background in remote sensing who are using remotely sensed data. And there is a real need to train that group of people. The second is that we're really advancing some of the big data and advanced data analysis approaches that Dr. LeDrew mentioned just now. So with that in mind, there's kind of these two groups. Now, with regards to industry perspectives, we identified kind of two areas where professionals felt there was a real need in the next 5 to 10 years for training. The first one is new algorithms, development, artificial intelligence for classification assessment. The second is even more so on the big data ingestion, online and cloud computing, analysis software, and especially, you know, these much more technical advancements in remote sensing that we can use to kind of solve these really big world problems. And that is where I think a lot of the remote sensing professionals and our students can go into in the future, not so much on the kind of preliminary use of remotely sensed data, but on the more advanced techniques and technologies. So these were kind of the major outcomes of this education and training paper and survey that came out of that, and we hope to have that published in the special issue from the last Canadian Remote Sensing Symposium. With regards to my perspectives on developing a CRSS, a CT certification program, as I mentioned, because we have these two groups of people who are using this data, certainly a modular certification program would be of interest. For example, you know, somebody who's a remote sensing technologist, basic use of remotely sensed data versus somebody who's a professional, somebody who can apply those more complicated advanced methodologies. I also thought that having an academic industry partner training and certification program was important, because it is really the industry who are often leading the way in what they need, and they're also the people who hire the students when when they've completed their program. So if we had an academic industry partner training and certification program, it would enable this important pathway for networking of students with these industry partners as well. And then finally, we really need a future-proof certification program. So one of the big areas that were of interest by industry is the use of open tools and open programming languages. QGIS was a big one, as well as Jupyter Notebook. Google Earth Engine is still a little bit proprietary and shared, so there was a little bit of concern on that. But using these open tools is highly desirable. So those are my perspectives on remote sensing training and gaps. Thanks, Chris.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Laura. Okay, we'll move quickly on to Gordon.
Okay, thank you, Chris, and good afternoon, everybody. I like to cook, and for anybody listening to this, you're thinking, have you turned into an infomercial at 3 in the morning? But what I've learned over the years from cooking is that you can add more spice to a meal, but it does not necessarily make it better. In fact, it can make it worse. And the connection to remote sensing, and it has to do with the proliferation of data, and especially the availability of free data, that there's an incredible amount of data out there. And I would argue that adding more data does not necessarily provide better information. And in fact, I think adding more data can actually hinder the information content. One of my degrees is in physics, and I always approach a problem by thinking about the fundamentals. What is the fundamental source of the data? What is the fundamental information in the data? And from my perspective on training, and maybe that some of that is done now, but my perspective on training, that with the advent, and Laura spoke about this with AI and the notion of big data, with the advent of AI and big data, I think it's extremely important that practitioners in the field of remote sensing understand the fundamentals of that data. And they look at that data and they say, this data, or whatever amount of data, will provide the information, excuse the pun here, that is the most palatable to the end user and provide that end user with the product they need. And I have seen, and I think there's a bit of a danger in taking as much data as you can, throwing at an AI solution and hoping that one comes out is what you need. So just to summarize on that, again, my perspective is understanding what is the fundamental information in the data, selecting the data that may go into an AI-based solution, but selecting that data with care. Moving on to the certification program, I think generally this is a really good idea, and I think can be especially important in the early career phase where people are trying to get themselves known, to separate themselves from other people. But built into that and part and parcel with that is that there's going to be a significant effort required to ensure that that certification meets certain standards, because without a standard-driven certification, it is virtually worthless to some degree. And the key aim there is to make sure that that certification has meaning, so that employers will look at that certification and go, I recognize this. This is important to my company. And by the same token, I think for the person who has that certification, when they have that, then there's a sense of pride in having that certification, that they have accomplished something and they're at a certain level or recognized with expertise in geomatics or remote sensing, as the case may be. But that's it, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Gordon. Okay, let's move to Craig, last of our PowerPoint slides for now.
Thanks, Chris, and hello, everyone. Yeah, I would echo almost everything that's been said so far. I don't really know if I can add much in that vein, but I can provide some perspectives, especially on the changing nature of funding in the post-secondary sector. So for those that haven't been paying attention to the scenario in Alberta, where it's like our government is deciding to test drive some different modalities of funding. So we're going to be challenged coming up. We're currently enduring some massive budget cuts, which are severely limiting our ability to offer programs, especially some of the programs in remote sensing, which have been innovations that our university and our department has put forward. But these traditional delivery modes that we have are leading into micro-credentialing and laddering modalities of the acquisition of some sort of credential. So in just a few weeks' time, I'm actually going to be running the first one of those for our university. I understand it's not a unique scenario across the country, but we also have an entire program. Our biggest challenge is how to staff it. Last time I had a look at the timetabling, it's everyone's fully committed all the time. So how are we going to mount this additional teaching? But it's also then therefore an opportunity. And with the experience that we've had recently with COVID-19 as well as teaching online, we will be able to offer micro-credentials in a blended modality. So that can be advantageous for this society. There's also all sorts of things that are happening across Canada in terms of capacity building to offer some of these opportunities. So I would encourage everyone to, the academics anyways, to be thinking about how you can best leverage some of these things going forward. Now, in terms of my perspectives on the certification program, I think there's a growing need to establish some baseline for scientific understanding, as Gordon was just pointing out. I think there's an issue there. There's an opportunity again with flip the coin every time. We all know that trick. We try not to be exclusionary. Remote sensing's always been a big tent, and I was able to listen to all the talks actually in the history session, and they were excellent. And that's really our history, right? And it would certainly hurt our progress if we decided to restrict it overly much. And then again with micro credentials and laddering, there's an opportunity there to build, as well as we have to have some standardization of baseline understanding and qualifications so that we know where we are at and what we are doing. So in other words, if someone was to take a micro credential via our university, would that transfer to yours in terms of having the ability as a society to build upon the national brain trust that we have in remote sensing. Anyway, that's it for my piece. Thanks, Chris.
Great, thanks very much, Craig. Okay, well, I'm going to stop sharing for the time being. Okay, so great, we're back into talking heads mode, and I'd like to hand it over to Joanne to give us your thoughts on those two questions, please.
Thanks, Chris. So I just want to start by saying my perspective is shaped very much by the fact that I work for a research-based organization. So skill sets that I look for when I'm hiring people for projects is obviously I want strong technical skills. I want good foundational knowledge in remote sensing. I want programming experience and familiarity with open source tools. But I also want strong written and oral communication skills, problem solving, and depending on the project, I may need domain-specific expertise in forestry, for example, or I will need specialized expertise with specific data types. And in terms of identifying gaps, I think this is often the area where there is a gap, and that's around this highly specialized technical expertise in working with a specific type of data, say LiDAR as an example. And so I think, we specifically design a lot of our projects. You think about big NSERC-funded projects in Canada, we look to train highly qualified people. That's one of the desired outcomes of these projects. But I think Dr. Chasmer, as she pointed out, often there's this linkage between how we're training people and what industry needs. And so I think that would be another. So that linkage between the academic side and the practical application side would be the second gap. So those two things. In terms of certification, I'm of mixed minds. I think it depends on what it looks like. I think the challenge for remote sensing science is that the breadth and depth of our discipline is so variable, it's so broad, it's so dynamic. I think a certification program is a huge commitment on the basis of the participant, but also on the society as well. And it's a long-term commitment, right? Because if people commit to getting this, we have to be able to offer this program over the long term. And I think, it's already been brought up. We're working in a context where remote sensing is becoming more ubiquitous. It's not just remote sensing specialists anymore that are doing remote sensing. It's a much broader community. So I see the need, getting back to the gap I mentioned, for more modular, more nimble kind of specialized training around some of these specific needs, whether it be LiDAR, radar, big data, AI, things like that. And I almost would think it would be strategic for the society to position itself to be the go-to source for specialized technical training in Canada, as a way to sort of leverage themselves into that context, as opposed to perhaps some larger bureaucratic certification program. Maybe that's a way to address needs in an industry that is so dynamic and that changes so quickly. Those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Joanne. Okay, so we're already starting to see some diversity of perspectives here, and so that's the panel's doing its job. That's great. Okay, so for a different perspective, perhaps Hamdi, student industry, which hat are you wearing today?
Thank you very much, Chris. That's great. I'll talk about a couple of perspectives. So I'll start from the industry perspective. Well, so I graduated from engineering school, electrical engineering particularly, and I've been working in the geospatial/remote sensing industry now for about 15 years. And the problem is, or the gap I see is basically the lack of awareness for students at the early age. So basically, since I graduated from the engineering school, I've been basically training myself on the job. So I was obsessed with image processing and how to change the aspect of images, increasing the whatever brightness and so on and so forth. And I didn't realize at that point of time that I'm looking at the remote sensing field, because I'm coming from an engineering school and we don't actually teach like the straightforward remote sensing courses, right? But I had passion for that. I didn't know, I didn't get some guidance on that. So the thing is, I spent a long time in my career path finding out the ingredients required to be a good remote sensing specialist, right? So then after that, I decided to come back again to the school and do my PhD. And the perspective with the gap I see from being a teaching assistant now for 3 years at my university is whenever you talk to a third year or fourth year student, for example, and you ask them, what do you want to do in the remote sensing field? They are kind of, they have the knowledge, they study courses, but sometimes they don't know why they study these particular courses in remote sensing. And that's a huge problem, that we have a big gap, that we give physics, mathematics, and even LiDAR equations for the grammetry and those kind of things, but we don't link this to the job requirements and the current challenges and even the future challenges, as in climate change, for example. So here is the gap. If we do have kind of guidance and kind of micro credentials, or basically we circle those courses together, as in, for example, if you want to work as a LiDAR design engineer, for example, the ingredients for this track, you have to study this, and that. But if you want to work in an application engineering for the remote sensing, so we circle those ingredients for this person, right? So that's kind of guidance that has to happen at the early age, as in the secondary school or maybe in the undergrad degrees. So these people have to know why they are studying these subjects, why they are going through that massive mathematics. Because at the end of the day, after 10 years from their graduation, they would know that, yeah, this algorithm, you studied this algorithm in the past, because that algorithm is the basic algorithm for the GPS. So I could encourage this program 100%. I see a big gap between what we're doing in the universities, what we're passing to students, and what the job market have right now. And of course, in order to prepare good caliber for the future challenges, including climate change and those kind of problems that basically threaten the world, we need to link this requirement, the job requirements, as Joanne said, and as Ellsworth mentioned in the history and lesson learned what we have, and we pass it on basically to people who are about to graduate, just to make them, straightforward to their goals, instead of just spending time doing try and error in their life, and finally they reach out to the same goal that people already reached before. Thank you very much. I think I mentioned the 4 minutes.
Yeah, pretty good. Hey, there's still 30 seconds left if you want to keep going, but
I'm okay by this. Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andy. Okay, Liz, last but definitely not least, hopefully you can bring us some different perspective as a US working with NASA. That would be great. Over to you.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk today, and I am coming from a slightly different geographical place. And I'm a contractor to NASA, so I have an industrial side, and then I also have kind of the government side. And so in thinking about this question, I reached out to a number of my collaborators, some from academia and some from like the contracting world, and some people from kind of the NASA kind of headquarters perspective, just to kind of get a full picture of what people that I know think here in the U.S. and who work with NASA. But of course, these views are just my own. But as far as thinking about remote sensing training gaps and needs, as others pointed out on this panel, I really think a lot about this push for cloud computing, how satellite data sets are becoming increasingly large. Of course, we have to be careful then with, we have a lot of data, but does that mean we can just use it all as it is? So I was thinking about what the NASA archive is for data. So right now, we have about 43 petabytes of data, and they expect that by 2025, we'll have 250 petabytes of data in our record, and it's going to be increasing by 114 terabytes per day, especially once we have a new satellite that launches NISAR. And so we're thinking about, yes, there's more and more data that's going to become available, and how are we going to use all of that? What machine learning techniques, what artificial intelligence techniques, deep learning, coding, using open source tools and technology. I think really kind of that whole push for moving things onto the cloud and being able to use these open source tools is going to be really important. And so I think that that's really kind of a gap and a need that the whole community is going to have. And then as far as the second question goes, thinking about a certification program, this is where I think I got a lot of different responses from the different groups that I polled, but it's from what I could kind of put together from all of that, it's kind of like with what Joanne mentioned, where it's when you're hiring somebody, you're looking for a number of different skill sets. And when Hamdi talked about it also, he was talking about how you're thinking about, the skill sets that are needed. Are you needing it for engineering, or are you needing it for applications? And I think in the beginning, if you're a new researcher, having these standardized certification programs can really be helpful. When you see that on a resume, especially for a recent grad, you know that the student has taken courses, that they have an interest in GIS, they have a capability and a capacity for it. And recent grads may not have a record of published papers, but then once you kind of move away from being a student and into industry or even academia or the government, I think that publication record can become really important for the civil servant agencies. So, if you were working for a military agency, though, you're not going to have a record of published papers because you're not going to be able to share any of that work. So I think there, having that certification going into that kind of field would be more important. But in a field where you can publish papers, that kind of becomes the de facto certification for many of my colleagues. And even thinking about what goes into a proposal and what qualifications you show in your proposal and what program officers are looking for when they're reviewing proposals, it's the publication record. But I think that in order to get people to where they need to be to write the papers, you need to have a certain skill set in remote sensing. So, there's my timer. Man, that goes so quick. So, so I think that that's really where I would end it. I think this is all cutting edge, and we need to think about going forward how we can think about certification, and also making sure that as the cutting edge research moves on, how do we keep the certification up to date with what the new things are that are happening?
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks, Liz. And thanks very much, all of the panelists, for doing a little bit of homework and preparing some thoughts for this discussion. So now what I'd like to do is hand it over to our audience to see if there's any questions come in the Q&A. I can see a couple. Celeste, I see 3. Is Linda the first? No, Kevin, sorry. Kevin.
I
Tell you
can
what, would you like to unmute Kevin so he could ask his question, maybe direct it to a particular panelist or anyone in general?
Okay, go ahead, Kevin.
Okay, maybe Kevin, are you there? Okay, well, we'll read the question. It's there for everyone to see. Would this certification be similar to professional certification as done by the Canadian Association of Physicists? Actually, I might just jump in and make a comment there, and that is that right now we don't know what a Canadian Remote Sensing Society certification would look like. It's a very good question, and one I think we're all asking. But before we even get to what the certification would look like, we need to make a decision as to whether or not we're going to move forwards. Okay, with that caveat, does anybody else have any thoughts on Kevin's question?
This is Ellsworth. If I could make a suggestion, I think one of the first things, if we want to go forward, is to find out how other groups do this. Because and we've had a lot of comments today about looking at specific skill sets and specific grades of experience, for example. Many of these certifications are done with very limited sets of rules, shall we say. For example, the Canadian Geomatics Society, one of the rules is you have to abide by their standards and you have to belong to the society. And I thought that was something that was not very stringent, and the other components aren't either. But we should look at some of these others to see exactly what they do require and how many hoops does a student have to go through to get to that point. But also how it addresses our needs. And a lot has been said today about what industry requires and what the educational experience might be. We also have to think about how it's going to be different from, say, a university master's or a university PhD. For example, does a graduate student expert in remote sensing also need to have a certification to get into some of these skill sets as well? So there's a lot of questions to be asked, but I think there's a lot of homework that we can do to find out what other people actually consider a certificate program to be.
Thank you, Ellsworth. Craig?
Can I go ahead?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of two different things. There's one side of it which would be certification program, and the society would have to commit to standardization and running and whatever. The other one is certification of skill sets, which is an evaluation. Now, I'm not too sure how the physicists run it, and I agree with Professor Ledru that would be your first step, right? The first step off this particular pathway would be to investigate what's done broadly nationally in terms of certification. I don't see this group, for example, I don't think we would have the capacity to run a program. I would see that universities and other participating organizations, which was one of the things that we discussed in the paper that Laura and Bob and I penned, that a part of it would be a modality of training that would involve not only university vision, but also, I mean, let's face it, the vast majority of students end up somewhere other than in the academy. So you've got to, that's a vision piece, right? So you could cycle people out into industry, and we should all be doing our level best to ensure that there's a certain standard that's brought to the table. I see that as probably having more value, but on top of that, again, as I mentioned in my remarks, there are opportunities within each one of these universities to mount elements of programs that would be advantageous for us as a society.
Thanks, Craig. Han, do you wish to respond to?
Thank you very much. Yeah, just a bit of follow-up here, because sometimes professional certification is kind of confusing people, because sometimes, well, you need just training to get familiar with the background, with the knowledge, with basically the capacity that you understand what you're doing. But sometimes there is some other depth in this term, which is basically being capable of being a practitioner at certain place. So the thing is, the knowledge will let you know about the technicalities, about understanding what you're doing in terms of, like, for instance, surveying, aerial photography, those kind of things. But in order to practice or basically to work in Canada, certain province, you have to go through the provincial standards for this, right? So in this case, we're going to look at the practicing side versus the training side. So sometimes you might need to train people, but they don't have to go to the field and do the job for government, for example. So here's the distinction. I'm coming from a country in the East where you can have a certificate, for example, in photogrammetry or in surveying, but you have to go through a training course there in order to be a practitioner or in order to be a land surveyor, for example. So that's a bit of distinction between the training or being a practitioner at a certain place on the earth.
Yeah, thanks, Hamdi. I could add to that in a second, but I'll see Liz wishes to make a comment.
Well, I was just going to mention, you talked about how different countries might then have different certifications. So if you're in a country and you get your certification there, and then you move to a new country, do you have to get recertified? Is it going to transfer? I think that's something that could end up being a barrier for people if they move around.
Yep. Thanks, Liz. And I think we're kind of converging on an important area of the whole topic, and that is that when it comes to certification, there's actually a broad spectrum of possibilities. CSRS many years ago did have a fledgling certification program where you could be grandfathered in based on your CV and your credentials. And maybe there's value in that kind of more ad hoc grandfathered in process. Then at the opposite end of the spectrum, we're talking more about professional licensing, where you cannot operate in a certain jurisdiction unless you have the designated professional license to practice. And I think that's what you're referring to, Hamdi. Without getting too much into that particular topic, given the size of our community right now and the membership, I don't believe we're talking about licensure, right? Because that is a lot to take on. But maybe we're not also talking about something that's ad hoc either. Maybe there's some space in the middle for something that actually does meet the needs of the community. And of course, that's what we're trying to explore right now, is if the need's there and what the possible solutions could be to that. So going back to the audience Q&A, I see Linda has a couple of questions. Celeste, can we unmute Linda so that she can ask her questions or paraphrase them as she wishes?
Hi, do you hear me?
Yes.
I have tons of questions. So I don't even know where to start. I strongly agree with Joanne and Elizabeth, and I think certification will be difficult in a field that's so, changing very quickly, and it's so diverse and broad. But a more specific question that I have is, if we come, how much worth will this certificate have? So if we think about a PhD graduate just entering the job market with more than 10 years of experience in remote sensing and geomatics, but not holding a certificate, and we compare that PhD graduate to a master's graduate that has less years of experience, but holding a certificate, I wonder which of the two you think will have a greater chance to be hired for the same job. The second part of the question is then more in an international perspective, and we somewhat touched this already, but likewise, how will the certificate be comparable internationally? And would international job applicants, for example, applying for a job in Canada, have to get the certificate before they're even having a real chance to secure a job? So you might think about that it's not very easy to get a certificate in a different country before coming to the other country where you apply for the job. And so, that's a barrier problem, like Elizabeth said. I think that's it for now. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Linda. Does anybody wish to respond to Linda or have any thoughts on those? Craig?
I could chip in a few thoughts. Just you're thinking about things a little negatively, Linda. I would think about these things a little bit more positively, that perhaps the ability to have certification would provide you opportunities in the job market that you may not have, because the credentialing would then be identifiable and respected and understood. And I think that's one of the problems that we face right now, is that with the increasing diversity that we have within the community, we struggle to have evenness in terms of what we have in the understanding of remote sensing as a science. So there's an opportunity within every one of the sort of negative possibilities, if you like.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. Anybody else have any response for Linda?
Yeah, I have a comment just to follow up on your question, Linda. I think it's a very, very good question, and it does introduce or begs the question, is the certification designed to be a proxy for education, or is the certification designed to be a representation that you have taken a certain level of courses and those courses are deemed to be of good quality? So this is akin to, for example, in Canada, the professional engineering program, that when you are deemed to be a professional engineer, you don't take another exam. You've gone through, and there's a series of questions on ethics, among other things, and therefore you are granted that PN status. And in my mind, the certification, if you are treating it as a substitute for education, that opens up a massive area of certification. And I think it's extremely difficult, quite frankly, to do that. And I would argue that the certification may mean that you've taken a certain number of courses and those courses are relevant to your area of expertise. But when you are going in for a job, a company, certainly I don't think our company would do that, would say, we're looking for somebody because we need someone at a PhD level, but someone with a master's degree, assuming they have equal experience, I would not think that being certified at a master's level would trump a PhD level, because they're quite different in terms of the background and the experience. So again, just to reiterate and summarize, in my view, the certifications should say that someone has taken these courses are deemed to be suitable to be certified as a practitioner in this area, but they are not a substitute for the education required in a given area of remote sensing or geomatics.
Thank you, Gordon. And actually, if I might add to that, I think this does bring up a very important aspect of this whole topic. And that is that a certification program does not necessarily require new curriculum or new courses. Just as an example, a certification program could evaluate what's already on offer and then accredit certain curricula, certain courses, certain programs. And so if you're a master's, PhD, undergraduate student, or even a trainee that's just out there trying to pick up a micro credential, you might seek certain courses, programs, or credentials that happen to have that society level certification because it gives a certain recognition. So that's just, I think we needed to inject that little bit of information there, because we don't want to prescribe what a certification looks like right now, but we do need to understand what's on option. And I think there's many ways that we could approach this. Okay, so we have about 10 minutes left, and we still have a couple of questions in the Q&A. So Sasha Nasanova, Celeste, could you unmute Sasha to ask that question?
Hello. I just had a question about what you think the job market will be like, and if this type of discussion, about certifications and whatnot is, warranted by the number of jobs that we have in Canada. Because currently we have, many PhD and master's programs that, seem to fill the need for the skill set. And I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Maybe could I direct that to Hamdi or Gordon, just to get an industrial perspective first, because maybe you're a little bit more on the pulse of hiring and firing and seeing what the needs are in that domain.
Can I go ahead? All right. Sorry. Thank you very much, Gordon. So basically, while I'm studying now PhD and working at the same time, and I would say that I want to refer a little bit to Linda's question when she was asking about whether or not the employer will decide that they're going to hire this person or not, based on the educational background versus the hands-on experience. I would say the employer prefers most of the time a mix of both. So that's why I can tell that the best way is, once you get a degree in remote sensing, for example, a bachelor, get into the industry right away, learn about everything, see the challenges, see the problem, and then once you have something really rich in your hands, or a big problem or issue or gap, you can come back to the academia and research as you go. Because the problem is, if you get your bachelor right away, you get mastered in the same field, and then a PhD, so you're kind of disconnected from what's going on the ground, right? So basically, right now, the mix of hands-on and degrees at the same time, or a well-educated person with master's or PhD, it has to be both there. So I witness, for example, in the employer I'm with right now, that a lot of scientists are there, while at the same time, a lot of hands-on experienced people are there as well, right? So the best combination is to have your degree from your university as a master's or PhD, in addition to good hands-on experience. That's why do not go dig into the academic career from day one in your life till the end of your life. Trust me, this is the straightforward thing I can advise here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Hamdi. I just want to remind everyone that we have about 10 minutes left. If Gordon, unless you had something really, really burning to say on this, I just wanted to ask Laura if this came up in the survey that they did last year. Did you notice anything in terms of respondent trends, in terms of the size and scope of the job market that's out there?
Yeah, this actually wasn't something that came up, but it was certainly something that, Bob and Craig and I discussed quite a bit at length. And one of the things that came up actually with the surveys was that there was a real desire to have people who have a broad ranging expertise. And I think, Hamdi, this kind of speaks to what you were saying as well. Like, when you go out and you speak to industry and you go and you do different things, it's much better than just, kind of having like a one-track mind kind of activity. And this really came out in what the industry respondents were saying, having this broad interest, being able to do lots of different things was really important. And I think that also speaks to the certification program too. Like, when you have a certification program, you're automatically kind of doing a lot more than just kind of, your undergraduate program or even maybe a more technical master's program. Thanks, Chris.
Okay, thanks, Laura. Again, mindful of time and the fact that there are still some questions in the Q&A, I'm going to move on. Saeed, you have a question for Ellsworth. In the interest of time, I'm just going to read it out loud. So Saeed's question is why the Quebec programs were excluded from the study. Can you comment on that?
Yes, and I've just provided.
Oh yeah, we've answered it. Yeah.
Okay, but perhaps for others, this was. I apologize if that was a miscommunication. That was a study by the GIS group done a bit ago, and it's online, and they didn't provide an explanation. The study that I did, that was the universities and colleges, did include Quebec, and in fact, we got several answers to the questionnaires in Quebec. So the study that's just reported that we gave about an hour ago does include everything across Canada. So I'm sorry if there's a misunderstanding there.
Thank you, Ellsworth. I noticed the next question from Emily Ogden. Will the certification come with a monetary cost? Now, I don't want to be dismissive of the question because it's a very, very important one and very relevant for a lot of people, of course. But what I will say is we're in the exploratory phase. At this point, we don't even know if we would move ahead with a certification program. If it happens, then all I think we can say about that is somehow the costs of mounting such a program would need to be covered. So I think that's all that can be said about that at this time. What I can say is that from my perspective, the discussions that have happened in the executive have not occurred from the perspective of, hey, we need to make money, let's create a certification program. It has come from the perspective of, what needs are there in the community? Is there a need for standardization? Is there a need to address certain gaps in the community? So that's the perspective that the society is taking. Will there be a cost? Well, there might be. But I honestly believe that's a premature topic for today. Maybe at next year's CRSS we'll get into that. Okay, so final question that we have in the Q&A, and I think this is a really excellent one from Eleanor Bash. Celeste, could you unmute Eleanor so she could ask her question?
Hi, thank you.
Hi, Eleanor.
I would just like the panelists to comment on how they think we could design a certification process that incorporates equity practices and doesn't end up creating more barriers to entering the field through less traditional routes. And I think that ties in nicely with a question about whether there's a cost associated, and we maybe can't answer that, but just, speak to how we can include equity in this thought process.
Well, thanks for that, Eleanor. Just based on the distribution of time spent on the questions, I will hand this one to Joanne and Liz. Not because you're female, but because I think you deserve more time to speak. So please.
You can go first, Joanne.
Well, I don't know that I have a good answer. I'm certainly not an expert in designing certification programs that are inclusive. I mean, I hear your point. I think it's very valid and very important. But I don't have a good answer. It's certainly not my expertise.
Eleanor, I'm really glad that you brought this question up and that you're bringing it up now at this session so that as the group moves forward to think about certification, this can be embedded into the work ongoing, because I too agree with Joanne that I'm not sure what the right way or the best way to do this is. And I think maybe it would be looking towards maybe looking at some other programs or certification programs, like ASPRS in the US has this certification program. Are they thinking about equity, and if so, how? And even things like the professional engineering programs, how do you make those equitable? So I think it's maybe a discussion that could happen at even a higher level to think more broadly across a number of these different platforms. How do we make all of them more equitable? I know with, like, I'm a member of the American Geophysical Union, and we now try to make sure that we make that meeting accessible to more groups than have been in the past. And so there are more scholarships offered to individuals from some minority groups and other groups to make sure that they can come and attend the meeting. And there's a push for a kind of co-production of knowledge in our work to make sure that different voices are heard. And so I think that going forward, the certification program should consider that as well.
Thanks, Liz. Laura?
I just had a question about whether this was about equity, in terms of, different groups, or if this was about equity in terms of learning experience. For example, people who are kind of have gone through the traditional routes of remote sensing training versus people who are kind of coming at it from the back end. Maybe they got into remote sensing because they were interested in forestry or ecology or some other discipline. So maybe, Eleanor, you could perhaps clarify what you mean by equity.
Well, that's a good question. I don't think that those two things are necessarily disconnected, that there are lots of people who don't necessarily have access to the traditional routes that some of us end up in this field, and may end up through other avenues coming to it later in their career. And so I think that they're not, they're connected for sure. And so I would say, like, it's both of those things, right? Like, how can we make sure that this kind of like certification program or a credential would be accessible to lots of different groups of people who have different backgrounds and experiences, but then also how can we make sure that it's accessible to people regardless of what interest group they may belong to or what identity they may have, that if they're coming to remote sensing from like not a, traditional like right through school kind of approach, that there's an avenue for them as well.
Thanks, Eleanor. I think the whole EDI topic again is one that we could spend quite a lot of time discussing. One brief comment I'll make on that is that EDI is considered in a lot of the actions and communications within the Society Executive. It is an important theme, and so any action we take, EDI implications are considered. What that would look like in a certification program, I honestly don't know. But would it be considered? Yes, it would, and we would be reaching out to the community for feedback on that. So thanks very much for raising that point, Eleanor. It is on our radar, to use a perfectly good analogy in the remote sensing community. Okay, so we are out of time for the Q&A, but I do notice there's a couple more questions. I will just very quickly respond to Ambika. If it happens, what is the tentative time to start this program? Bottom line is we don't know. What I can tell you is the executive has started to discuss it. It's on our agenda, and we are exploring the viability. So if as a result of our questionnaire and this panel, the general consensus is we should continue on this path, then in our future meetings, we will be discussing this and trying to implement something. I imagine if that's successful and we're optimistic about it, maybe we could make an announcement at the next CSRS. But honestly, don't hold me to that. That's just an optimistic tentative timeline. Nothing has been decided on that yet. Okay, I'm very cognizant of time, and I see that questions are coming in right at the last minute. Linda, I'm sorry, maybe we can take that question offline. Eleanor, thank you, that's great. Derek, interest in survey results from recent weeks, today's poll. Okay, that's exactly where we're going right now, so thanks for that, Derek. I'm going to share my screen for the last few minutes. I'm going to thank the panelists for your time and the homework that you did and for the thoughts, the wide diversity of thoughts and opinions that were shared today. And so I'm going to try and wrap things up with the results from the questionnaire. But first, Celeste, can you share the poll results with everybody? So just a reminder, the first question is, should the CSRS SCT develop a certification program? So what we see here is 27 out of 55, so almost 50% say yes, only 4 out of 55 say no, and 13 out of 55 say maybe. So that's generally a positive response. Would you, as an individual, seek certification? So a little bit less than half, so 40% or so say yes, a few on the maybes, a few on the no. So generally more positive, but not as positive as should we do it. The stratification results, I don't really have time to get deeply into here, but it looks like we have a mix. So we do have students, 21 students, 17 people that supervise and have a play a role in hiring, and 11 out of 55 that play a role in education. So these are relevant perspectives from a good cross-section of the community. Okay, last couple of minutes. I'm going to share the results from our the questionnaire that was distributed a few weeks ago. So many of you, hopefully most of you that are here today, remember this survey. If you haven't had a chance to take the survey and would like to, it is still online. It's at this link. If you don't have time to copy that down, feel free to email me and I can send you the link. We are certainly trying to get everyone's opinion on this. But here are some of the high-level results as they stand today. We asked the same question. Should the Canadian Remote Sensing Society develop a certification program? Just over 50% said yes, between 30 and 40% said maybe, and only just over 10% said no. So again, generally a positive result. Only 12% said no. And then would you personally seek certification if a program were created? So between 40 and 50% said yes. The maybes went down to about 20%. A higher proportion of the community did say no. So 1/3 of the community would not be interested in taking a certification themselves, but 2/3 of the community generally think there might be some value in a certification program for themselves. Now this one, I found this one quite interesting. This is where we asked which attributes of a certification program do you think might be most beneficial to you in your role within the remote sensing community? And I don't really have time to get deeply into these, but a number of options were in there related to standardization of credentials or demonstration of experience and so on and so forth. And really no single attribute of a certification program stood out as being the most valuable. If anything, there was some value in all of the potential virtues of a certification program. And I think this is the last question. So we asked, should a Canadian remote sensing certification have levels? And in this, I think we're thinking of the ASPRS certification, because there's technologist and professional. I think there might even be a scientist level. And so that was kind of the incentive for that question. And interestingly, the community was split 50-50 on that. Some people prefer no single certification, everyone gets the same thing. And whereas other people would like to see some customization of the certification into different levels or different themes. So clearly we need to do a little bit more homework on that. But that's it for our survey. That is it for our time. We're exactly on 3:20. We do have to end it quickly because we've got a short break and then we move into our next keynote. Once again, thanks to the panelists and thanks to the audience for your participation. And I really do hope to see everyone in about 15 minutes in our for the start of our closing session and our keynote speaker from CSRS. So thank you all very much. Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.